Hello, everybody. Welcome again to AuthorStory. I'm Alexander Lim, your host. And for this episode, I'm interviewing Lisa Danylchuk, author of the book Embodied Healing, Using Yoga to Recover from Trauma and Extreme Stress. And for those of you following along who are interested, you can go over now to the Amazon link in the description below the video and check out or get a copy of the book. So Lisa, welcome to AuthorStory. It's our privilege to have you as our guest today.
Thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. So Lisa, please tell us about yourself as a writer. What's your author story?
Well, I've been working with yoga and working with people who are recovering from trauma for many, many years, and I've always felt that I wanted to write something and to offer what I've learned in some kind of really accessible format. So, some of the people I've worked with over the years have been in really low income areas and places where there's not a lot of access to education. So one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is so I could have something on Amazon. I can't necessarily go and work in all the places I want to or present in all the places I want to, but it was a good way to kind of get a foundation out there for people so they can kind of understand some of the work that I've done and hopefully apply it.
Right. Okay. So I'm just curious. Are you licensed in any sort of way, like a therapist or something like that?
Yeah. So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of California. Yeah, and went through quite a bit of hoops to get there. So I studied undergrad at UCLA and my graduate work at Harvard, and always kind of working with at-risk populations. But yeah, licensed in marriage family therapy. Also, I was licensed briefly in Massachusetts, but I transferred everything to California. And then I'm also an experienced registered yoga teacher, certified through YogaWorks.
Okay, all right. So those are like two entirely different things, just to confirm. Therapist and yoga instructor, those are like two entirely different things.
Yeah, well, it's great that you say that, because to me they're not all that different, but I think in the general mindset they are, which is part of why I wanted to write this book.
Okay. I mean, I'm not too familiar with that many licensed therapists who are yoga instructors and vice versa. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a little group of us, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's becoming more common.
Okay. All right. Cool. Fantastic. Okay, so now about the book. Can you just tell us a little more about it?
Sure. So the book just kind of goes through what I just said to you, which is foundations in trauma treatment that I really think everyone should know. You kind of go through all these years of study and you come to learn things and you think, why doesn't everyone know this?
Right.
So foundations in trauma treatment, foundations in yoga philosophy. I think part of why people don't really see psychotherapy and yoga going together is we understand yoga so much as kind of almost contortion, right, of postures and being bendy and we kind of stereotype it to be a certain type of person. But really the foundations of yoga philosophy have so much wisdom that really connects with trauma theory, actually. So in the book, I lay that out, trauma theory and yoga philosophy and how they're connected, and how people who are using one or the other or both can do so in a way that's really well integrated.
Okay, all right. So for whom is this book intended? I mean, you did mention this intended for, like, you did work for like low income people, low income clients. Is this intended for just for them, or just about anyone can pick something up from this?
Well, I think I'd love anyone to pick it up who's curious. And honestly, the book is intended more for the people that are serving those populations. I wrote it so it was equal access, and anyone could get it. I've had it free a few times on Amazon, but they limit the amount of times you can do that. So it's I try to keep it low cost, but it's mostly for providers and people who have a foot in one field or the other. So either they're yoga teachers or they're in the mental health world. Sometimes I've had people work with me who are nurses or in the medical field as well. So it's really meant for those providers to understand why they're doing what they're doing and to do it with intelligence. Because I think yoga and trauma are both getting popular, at least where I am in the world. And when something's popular, people tend to just, throw anything at it, right? Like, oh, yoga's good for this, do it. Yoga's good for that. And so I wrote this also so people could be really more specific and intelligent with their choices if they're using yoga and mental health work.
Right, right, okay. So, was there any particular incident, something that happened or a realization that made you think, maybe I should write something about this?
It was more of a long-term nagging feeling.
Oh, okay, all right, okay,
Um,
okay.
I say nagging feeling, but more of like an inspiration and a desire of the heart. I felt like for a long time I just felt like, oh, I want to write and I want to carve out some time to write and I want to put this on paper and
Okay.
I still want to write more. Um, so there wasn't one specific event that made me say I'm going to write this. It was more a yearning for a while, and then I just decided to, you know, make it happen.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. And the results are pretty good. I mean, you've got a book out of it, and it seems to be a really impactful one.
Yeah, from all the reports I've gotten back, it's doing really well, and I've gotten emails from people all over the world, Australia, India, London, the US, Canada. Unfortunately not in Spanish-speaking countries yet.
Okay.
I hope to translate it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm really pleased, and I love nothing more than to get an email from someone who's read it and appreciates it.
Yeah, cool, cool. Okay. So, Lisa, since you've got some training in the scientific aspects of stress and trauma, and maybe you can help my listeners and maybe even myself as well, what the real deal is with stress and trauma. I mean, like, there are some things, some stress and traumas you can just, go poo poo and they'll go away, or with statements like it's all in your mind, with logical arguments and all that stuff. But um, there are some stress and traumas that cannot just be treated that way. I mean, like, what comes to
Hmm.
mind is like PTSD, Armed Forces veterans. What, if anything, goes in, I don't know, our brains, our bodies that make major stresses and major traumas so difficult to manage?
Yeah, and I'm glad you differentiate that because there's some amount of stress is actually good for us, right? If we have an appointment, we get up and we mobilize and we respond to it. But really, what I'm focusing on here is extreme trauma, extreme stress. When so much stress has stacked up that it's really impacting our whole system, mind, body, emotions, energy, spirit.
Right.
But the crux of a lot of this, and interestingly, a lot of what connects the two fields, yoga and trauma treatment, is our nervous systems, right? And our nervous system is our brain and all the nerves that go down through the spine and through the whole
Right.
body.
Right.
So, what can happen with trauma is the nervous system will either get hyper aroused, which is kind of too much energy stuck like it's just mobilized to fight or to flee, and that
Mm.
can look like anxiety, and that can look like um, anger, and that can look like a lot of different things in the body.
Mm.
It can also lead us to kind of the opposite effect, which is hypoarousal, which is a parasympathetic activation. And it gets a little confusing because there's good parasympathetic and then there's this kind of shutdown parasympathetic.
Okay.
And so if you're hypoaroused, that's not quite enough energy. So that might be if someone's depressed or
Mm.
dissociated or numb or kind of checking out.
Mm.
That can be another effect of trauma. So with the populations I've worked with who have been through a lot of different types of trauma, you mentioned veterans, there's also survivors of, intimate partner violence,
Right.
there's
Right.
also youth and growing up in um, housing developments where there's violence next door
Right.
and things like that. So there's a lot of ways we can be exposed to trauma, and it's not necessarily common knowledge that we can respond in this way. And so what happens is a lot of young people or even veterans coming back from war can be misdiagnosed or not completely understood in their symptoms.
Mm.
And if we miss that there's trauma there that's kind of sparked some of these symptoms, then we miss an opportunity for treatment. So
Mm.
too often someone like a young person growing up, say, I used to work in Watts in California and in a pretty notorious housing development, and the youth would grow up with violence next door and physical abuse in the home and drug and alcohol abuse in the home and nearby. these are all traumatic experiences, some of them really stacked on top of one on top of the other. And so if that kid then shows up to school and can't pay attention,
Yeah.
it actually makes a lot of sense given their surroundings at home and given the opportunity for their nervous system to be in that zone. We call it the window of tolerance, to be in that zone where you can focus and you can think and you can relate and do all these things. So there are stories like this. I'm just giving one example of a youth
Right.
in a housing development, but there are examples of this, with really any population that's been exposed to trauma. So if you're really trained in trauma, you can kind of understand different physical, mental, emotional health concerns or symptoms through that lens, and when you understand it through that lens, you can offer things that are more sustainable in terms of long-term healing. So rather than someone getting Adderall for ADHD at age 10, if they're doing meditation, or if they're understanding the context that's causing it, and you can advocate for change there, that's going to be much more helpful over the course of the next 5 years. Right. So that's kind of the foundations of it.
Okay. So if I may ask, what makes these particular traumas so, I don't know the word for it. I guess sticky. I mean, it like stays with people for a long time. It can be brought up at like years or even decades after the fact. What makes these kinds of traumas, yeah, well, sticky, last so long?
Well, if you went to the DSM-5, which is the current kind of mental health diagnosis reference, it would, some kind of trauma, there'd have to be exposure to violence or exposure to death, something like that. And it's interesting because sometimes even an emotional threat can be a trauma, right? It might not be, so it being shamed or being bullied, for example, it might not be physical bullying, it might be more emotional, but that can also, we can have similar responses. So there's that, and then it's different people respond in different ways.
Okay.
So many factors. I mean, one side of this that I talk a lot about that's becoming increasingly present in mental health in particular is resilience and just strengths in general. So some people have a lot of supports. If you grew up in a home with one or two people who love you, that's going to make a big difference in how you respond and your nervous system and how it's been nurtured. So there's actually a lot of ways this connects to our personality and many other things. So there's really no way to tell before a trauma happens. You could get a sense of who might cope better, definitely, and someone who's had a pretty stable course of development is probably going to recover faster than someone who has, moved 20 times and been exposed to violence and things like that. But it's interesting because we actually measure the trauma by the person's response more so than by the event. So we might go through the same thing, both in a natural disaster together, and we both might respond very differently. So as a mental health professional, you're really looking at the experience of the person, the interpretations, and how their unique nervous system responds. Because obviously a nervous system is the result of genetics and what parents bring and your upbringing and all these things. And so each one of us is so unique. And that's what kind of makes this an art, because there's no single recipe in terms of trauma recovery for every person. There's absolutely a lot of tools and a lot of theory, but you've got to learn to apply that and ask the right questions, which again is why I wrote this book, because people to get, you can't, as people ask me all the time, or they think or hope the book is just a series of 10 poses that are good for trauma. And, there are poses that are helpful, but it's more about knowing what questions to ask and knowing what choices to make.
Okay, cool. I got that. Cool. All right. So very individualized then.
Yeah.
All right. So before we go any further, I'd just like to, focus a little bit on the magnitude of the situation. Do you have any stats or any idea of just how widespread serious stress and trauma is? I mean, if there are plane loads of people suffering from it, that can't be good for society, right?
Right. Yeah. And if you look at different populations, like veterans, for example,
Mm-hmm.
there are actually a wide variety of stats, and I do have some in the book.
Mm.
But when you look at how many people suffer from trauma, and then when you look at how many veterans, for example, just to take one population that's exposed to extreme stress,
Right.
if you look at how many veterans then commit suicide, even if they're getting some mental health treatment like medication or something like that,
Right.
it really is, I think, even if you look at one population like that, it becomes very serious and very dire quickly.
Mm.
I personally can think of two friends in the last 5 years who have lost their siblings to suicide who were
Oh,
veterans
geez.
of PTSD, right? And I
Right.
think it's actually pretty common and sadly increasingly so that people are losing people to this, mental health, you can call it a disorder or a disease, but it's really a normal reaction to really stressful circumstances.
Right. Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. I got that. So, Lisa, how was stress? I mean, I'm sure stress has been treated medically, clinically before. How was it? How is it treated traditionally?
It's actually a post-traumatic stress disorder isn't that old,
Okay.
and people have taught it. It started with sort of what were they calling it? Shell shock,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
you see veterans coming back from war, and you can see some of these pictures from as recently as World War II, even, and you look at pictures of faces, and you can just see that people are massively dysregulated, and that's really as a result of their nervous systems being kind of shot, so to speak. So
Right.
um, I lost my train of thought. What was the question?
How was it treated traditionally? I mean, is it like the traditional picture we have, like a patient lying on the couch and the psychiatrist listening, or what methods were used?
I don't think talk therapy was really used so much. Things like ECT, sort of electric shock therapy
Oh,
were
okay.
used. I think people just didn't understand it very well. There were some people even 100 years ago, Freud and Pierre Janet, who actually did have a pretty good understanding of trauma, but the people around them didn't quite get it. And
Right.
so when you look back at some of their writings, you can see that they were really foreshadowing what we've learned,
Hmm.
uh, which is interesting. But in terms of treatment, I think even in the last 20 years, we've come a really long way in terms of understanding what's happening and how we can respond to it. And now there are methods like EMDR
Hmm.
and neurofeedback, and there are a lot of trauma informed variations on therapies. And I still think we actually have a long way to go. While trauma is
Mm.
getting more popular, people don't necessarily understand, or clinicians in the mental health community,
Right.
there aren't a lot of people who understand dissociation, which is what happens for some people in really extreme forms of trauma. So I think we still have a long way to go, and we're learning a lot in terms of treatment, but the early treatments were pretty crude and just not really informed. And I don't think the first response was for people to lay on couches. I think the
Right.
first response was more medical, because people were
Okay.
really seeing the physiological effects of it, right? I mean, I've
Hmm.
seen in textbooks, they'll just have pictures of soldiers with shell shock, and you look at their faces, and it's actually, as we understand it now, trauma really is a brain injury, right? It
Hmm.
does impact your brain. And so when you're talking about veterans, they're likely suffering from PTSD and traumatic brain injury
Right.
separately, but both of those sort of overlap as well.
Mm. Okay. Okay. Cool. And how about your method? I mean, what's it all about? How does your method differ from these traditional methods?
Well, I work with people in a lot of different ways. And so I have tools like hypnosis and EMDR and yoga and neurofeedback. And I try to just listen to what is happening with them and choose the modality with the client that is going to be most helpful for them. And some people already come to me with a sense of what they want to do, or they've heard this is helpful from a friend. And so maybe they want to try EMDR, or they just want to talk to someone. And shame is such a huge player in situations like this, especially around sexual violence. People who have perpetrated, it can be so hard just to say out loud to another human being that something has happened, let alone tell the story. And I don't think everyone even has to tell the story, because we have a lot of helpful methods to support support your brain and to support your emotional healing. But I've had people come to me who say, I don't want to talk about it. I'm like, that's fine.
Okay.
There's a saying in trauma recovery: the slower you go, the faster you get there. So if you have someone come and say they don't want to talk about it, what's typically happening is either some amount of overwhelm and often some degree of shame, right? Of feeling like, a lot of times things happen to us and we feel like, oh, I'm wrong or I'm bad because this happened. And so to say it to another human being is huge. So while I have a lot of tools in terms of treatment, a therapeutic relationship is really foundational in that, and building trust and feeling like, you're seen in a positive light, even as you're kind of processing through some of these challenging or negative experiences.
Right. So I get it, the treatments then, so to speak, are individual. I mean, like yoga might work for one person, but might not work for another. EMDR might work for one person, it might not work for another, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's also timing. And, when you're talking about yoga, there are a lot of different ways to apply it. I use breath work with a lot of my clients. Breath work, very simple meditation exercises and focused concentration. All of that is yoga. We tend to think of the physical postures, but I use that with clients. I do use physical postures as well, and kind of integrate yoga with somatic therapy in terms of connecting with the body. When we're thinking about something traumatic happening, it's not like just your mind or just your brain went through it. Your nervous system goes through your whole body, and often there are impulses to respond, and those can just carry a ton of energy. It's almost like people often carry experiences forward in their bodies and in their minds, even though the experience itself is done. So you can use yoga or movement or any of these tools I've mentioned to help people process it, so it's not so alive in the moment anymore.
Okay, cool. Okay, got that. So Lisa, let's say you come across someone, who's presently experiencing a lot of stress, or who has experienced some really bad trauma in his or her past. And you only had enough time to tell that person one thing about healing or recovering from that. What would be that one thing you would tell him or her, and why would you tell them that?
Wow. I feel like I would love to know, if I knew something about that person, I think I would love to ask a question first.
Okay.
And just ask them maybe how they want to feel, or what their kind of, not to say what their goal is, but I think instilling hope is really important. So if I were going to say one thing, especially to someone who just went through something completely overwhelming, and is, especially if they're feeling hopeless, which is really common, I would want to say it's possible to heal and recover from this. And a lot of people that do, interestingly, then want to go on to share it, because they've been in such a place of stress and overwhelm, and they've been at that point of like, there's no way this could ever get better. And through the process of healing, they get better. And so I'd like to just tell that person and people out there who are struggling and, have been through traumatic and overwhelming experiences, that there is help, and it does work. And so if you have been trying to get help and it's not working, just keep trying, and I know that can be hard too, and look for the people that make you feel safe and supported and soothed, and those are the people that are going to be best to help you.
All right, cool. Okay, got that. So is there anything else, like other stories, other topics that you may want to write about in the future?
Yeah, I want to write more about just general healing. I don't
Okay,
think everyone identifies as being traumatized.
right.
I think we've all experienced some form of trauma in our lives, and so I want to pull from yoga and all these different healing modalities I've studied just to offer kind of how we can heal. That's the name of my website. And so how can we as individuals and as groups and communities and nations, how can we kind of pave a road towards healing? That's something that's always been interesting to me. I do some work with an international society for trauma, and I do some work with them through a UN task force where we're just trying to educate. And so again, I'd like to write on healing just to instill hope and offer this information I've learned, because I feel like it's so helpful, and sometimes feels obvious once you read it or know it, but isn't always obvious in those moments that are really
Right,
crucial. Yeah.
right. Okay. So in the last minute or so of this interview, are there any last words of wisdom you would like to share to inspire our listeners? Anything at all?
Mhm. Just to reiterate what I said, I think everyone goes through some form of trauma.
Hmm.
So, if you've been through trauma and you're making it something negative about you, it's absolutely not. It's almost a fact of life, and sometimes awful things happen to really good people, and there's help out there. So, I think if I had one more point to drive home, it's just you're not alone. You're
Mm,
not alone in this, and everyone's going through it. And the more we can talk about it, I know in some cultures, even here in the States, there's still like a stigma on therapy. Like it means there's something wrong with you or you're
right.
crazy. Absolutely not. Like I said earlier, trauma is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation.
Mm,
So if you're dealing with any of these symptoms like anxiety and depression and flashbacks or bad dreams, like that's just a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So just know that you're not alone and there is help. And if there's anything in the way of that stigma wise, or if you think it means something bad about you, I just want to nip that and
okay.
just say no, that's not what's happening. It's a totally normal to have a response to trauma.
Okay, cool. Those are definitely words of wisdom right there. So in closing then, our guest is author Lisa Danylchuk. Her book is Embodied Healing, Using Yoga to Recover from Trauma and Extreme Stress. And you can find her book at her website at howwecanheal.com. That's howwecanheal, one word.com, as well as on Amazon and other online bookstores. So, Lisa, thank you very much for your time and for being on Author Story. It was great to have you with us as our guest.
Thanks so much, Alex. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Of course, for those of you listening, if you want to get Lisa's book, Embodied Healing, you can get it right now by going to the Amazon link in the description below the video. And of course, if you'd like to follow our author interviews on YouTube, yep, it's easy. Just click on subscribe. So long for now, but I'll be back next time on Author Story with another inspiring author.